Okay, welcome everyone. Bit hard for us to see. I'm assuming that everybody's online. Welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. We're doing our webinar today on managing challenging workplace conversations and people risk. My name's Bronwyn Dennis. I'm the Manager of Learning Solutions here at IHR. And joining me today is Paul Davey, our Manager of Workplace Relations. Morning, Paul.
Morning, Bronwyn.
Before we start today, I'd just like to share some information about IHR Australia. We're a specialist workplace relations and human resources consultancy that helps organisations manage people risk in a practical and commercially focused way. We support businesses across the full employee life cycle, including workplace relations advice, assisting with things like performance and conduct matters, undertaking complaints management investigations, helping you review and update your workplace policies. And the area that I look after, we do training around leadership, respectful workplace behaviours, managing psychosocial risk. Our aim is to help organisations act early, respond fairly, and use the right processes before workplace issues escalate into legal, safety, cultural, operational problems. Today's webinar is exploring the risks that can arise when we put off having difficult conversations or stepping in to deal with the situation in a way that is proportionate to what the issue is. Uh, it's about what leaders do when they notice performance concerns, inappropriate behaviour, conflict, or other warning signs, and about stepping in early can help stop an everyday issue becoming a much bigger one. Good morning, Paul. I guess you see a lot of matters that have escalated in your role as manager of workplace relations.
Good morning, Bronwyn. And yes, I've seen it many times. And one thing I notice a lot is that legal and organisational risk often doesn't start with one dramatic incident. It evolves. It builds when expectations are unclear, when behaviour is allowed to continue unchecked, when feedback is delayed, or a concern is treated as someone else's problem. So our first response matters. It can restore clarity and control, or it can create a second problem on top of the first.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, Paul. Obviously, here at IHR, we talk about risk and compliance a lot, and we often deal with situations where people are needing help to make sure they've been compliant when they're dealing with a matter. But for me, it's key to acknowledge that compliance starts with culture. Those everyday ways that we engage with each other, the behaviours to reward, those that we ignore. We're just going to start the session today with a poll. I'm just going to launch that poll and we're going to leave it open for about 20 seconds. If everyone could just respond to that, and then we'll have a look at what those responses look like. I think we've got a fair proportion of responses there, so we might just end that poll, Nat, and have a look at what those results look like. Certainly there we can see that probably the two that are common is addressing performance issues or missed deadlines and things early, and we'll certainly talk about that today. Disrespectful or disruptive behaviours and that conflict between team members. Interesting that those ones come up because, from my perspective, in the training space, they are programs that we often have clients reaching out to us, wanting to deliver our managing everyday performance, our respectful workplace behaviours, and our resolving workplace conflict. Thanks for that, Nat. The common thread across all of those issues for me is that delay really makes those dealing with those issues easier. Over time, facts can become less clear, frustration grows, and the behaviour can start to shape the team culture. Paul, what would you call out as a key message in how we respond to these issues?
Bronwyn, I think it's important to note that managers have an obligation to address behaviours, especially given the increased focus we are seeing on managers for managing psychosocial hazards and our duty of care in the new world of positive duty to provide safe workplaces. So early intervention does not mean overreacting and making everything formal. You don't want to crack a peanut with a sledgehammer, but it means noticing when things are happening, assessing the risk and choosing to respond when it occurs and responding in a way that's proportionate to the issue.
So yes, Paul, as you say, proportionate to the issue. How often do you see in what you do those costly, difficult situations ending up in the courts, in Fair Work maybe, that start with someone choosing not to have that difficult conversation early? Maybe what could have been resolved over a cup of tea, cup of coffee, and a chat might become a bullying complaint, an unfair dismissal, because of that reluctance to have that early conversation.
Robin, you see that we see that quite a bit in relation to the behaviour and conduct, and often matters that end up in forums. The the part that's attacked is the process and the early intervention and the informal stage and the escalation to the more formal stage. So, yeah, you do see that a lot, and I have seen that a lot in my working time.
Okay,
So,
yep. So
what are some reasons that you've seen for people avoiding these conversations?
yeah, look, interesting question there, Paul. Look, from my experience, lots of reasons. I think a key one, and we find this comes up a lot in our discussions in training, is we tend to have a fairly avoidant style of communication in leadership in Australia. I think it's a bit ironic, really. I think, as a culture, we tend to have a bit of a view of ourselves as very straight speaking people, but in our workplaces and in our communication style, we actually tend to have a fairly passive way of communicating. We have a lot of leaders that are uncomfortable with conflict, and so they might just look the other way, write off some small signs of conflict or poor performance. They might sort of think that little examples of conduct are not so important. Maybe they sort of feel that people really should be able to resolve those issues or conflicts themselves without me stepping in to resolve. Unfortunately, what I find happens is often that behaviour escalates. It can become a much bigger issue if we don't deal with it early. I also see a lot of times where someone's been put on a performance plan, maybe some other formal action being taken, and then they become a bit blindsided because they genuinely feel they haven't been provided with feedback on their performance. That avoidance of providing that feedback creates a situation where someone might not really need to necessarily have understood that they were doing something wrong, that they needed to correct their behavior or improve performance. And then we end up in situations where people have very strong emotions. They're upset. They're a bit taken aback by that feedback, and then they become not receptive to the feedback. So I guess the key message here is our aim is not to turn every issue or concern into a sort of full-blown case or formal situation. It's preventable. It's preferred to respond early, fairly, and at the right level.
Yeah, that's right, Bob. And I suppose then, what would you recommend as a starting point for organisations wanting to address issues and resolve conflict, difficult workplace situations, so performance, workplace behaviour, or conflict?
Mm. Yeah, look, in a lot of our programs, Paul, particularly our Respecting the Workplace and Custodians of Culture program, but also in our leadership programs, we make the point that workplace culture is not just a set of values that we put up on a wall, on a screensaver. Maybe we print them on our water bottles or our lanyards. We see that around. It's actually what people experience in their day-to-day interactions with each other. The language that's used, the behaviours that are encouraged, what it actually feels like for our staff to be in the workplace. We would say the way we do things around here. Sometimes people talk about the vibe. Now, culture, we'll just put our slide up, guys, if we can there. Culture affects performance, well-being, reputation, and the organisation's ability to meet its legal and policy obligations there. Strong workplace cultures will see engaged employees performing at their best, psychosocial safe environment, a good employment brand that attracts and retains staff, and compliance with those policies and procedures. The leadership team needs to be deliberate in deciding what they want that culture to be. We need to make sure that the systems of work, the policies and procedures, our reward system, the capabilities of our managers and our staff are all aligned to achieving that culture. Paul, from your perspective, what are some of the ways that our leaders can be deliberate about that?
But I think one of the mistakes organisations make is assuming that culture is something you can just ask people to have. In reality, culture is a learned behaviour. It's built off the systems and decisions that sit behind the day-to-day workplace operation. So, if you want a respectful, safe, accountable culture, you need to make it easy for people to understand what's expected and give leaders the tools to respond consistently when issues arise. That starts with having clear policies and procedures that define expectations, standards of behaviour, and provide a practical guide on how concerns should be raised and managed. Policies should not just exist to satisfy legal requirement, and sometimes they're written. Sometimes HR people write them for themselves a little bit, but they really need to be practical. They need to help people understand how the organisation expects them to behave and how it will respond when standards aren't met. Organisations also need to follow through on their policies. So if poor behaviour is ignored or standards are not applied consistently, employees will quickly work out that what's written in the policy isn't really a part of their culture. So the culture becomes what the behaviour and standards the leaders are prepared to tolerate and are prepared not to tolerate. So, Bronwyn, from your perspective, how do good leaders set the culture and how do they go about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important for the leadership team, for the organisation to have a really good sense of what they actually want that culture to be. You know, we don't have homogenous cultures. Different cultures exist in different organisations for different reasons. We need to be clear about that culture. We need to have regular conversations about how well the team's holding themselves to that. And for me, that's critical. I think training is another important part of that. We can't expect managers to have things like effective performance conversations, respond to complaints, resolve workplace conflict, or recognise people risk if they've never been taught how. Often I talk about often the accidental leader. You know, we often in our first leadership role, we've been really good at our technical area. We've been a great employee. We spent a lot of time learning how to be that technical expert. And then a vacancy comes up, or we're on a career pathway, and leadership is the next step. But often we don't get a lot of training or support before going into those first management roles, and we're sort of expected to just, I guess, know how to do that, learn by osmosis. But again, building those capabilities, organisations building those capabilities gives leaders the confidence to step in early. If they have the skills and understanding of the techniques, that confidence arises, and then you might not get them avoiding those difficult situations, and that's when they become bigger problems. We also need to make sure that we're setting those expectations and that we're reinforcing that through the employee life cycle. So things like our recruitment and induction procedures, what our culture is around the giving and receiving feedback, performance discussions, coaching our employees, and recognition. All of those communicate the organisational values. So when those messages are consistent, people are much more likely to understand the behaviours that are expected from them. So from my perspective, good culture isn't accidental. It's created when leadership, policy, systems, capability, and those everyday management practices are all working to the same standard. So when those things are aligned, organisations are not only just creating a better place to work, they're also significantly reducing their people risk. When you're working on some of your investigations, Paul, is there a style of leadership that you think has more risk than others in creating those safe workplace cultures?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bronwyn. And there's probably three styles of leaders that can sort of tend to create some risk. So the first is that very direct result focused leader who acts quickly but overlooks impact and fairness at some time. So many leaders who take that sort of approach tend to have a habit of trying to catch employees that they manage doing it wrong rather than doing it right, which
Mm,
can create a negative work environment and can lead to employees feeling that they are being micromanaged. The second is the hands-off leader who hopes the issue will resolve itself and avoid stepping in. So the head in the sand
mm,
approach, so to speak. The third is that overly matey leader who applies standards inconsistently. So it often depends on who their pals are in the workplace as to how
mm,
they
mm,
treat the people
mm.
they manage.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I can certainly see myself in some of those leadership styles, Paul. My default is the direct results focused leader, and I often have to pause and reflect on how that style is being, whether that fits the situation, how that's being experienced. I think the important thing is there that we all have a default leadership style, and none of those leaders are necessarily trying to create risk in their workplace. We talk about intent versus impact. They might not have an intent to come across in a particular way, but sometimes when we're under pressure, when we're under a bit of a stress, that default style can get in the way of and what the actual situation really needs. I think a key point there to reflect on is that a leader's silence is not neutral. If you don't call out behaviour, if you tolerate behaviours, if you tolerate lower levels of poor performance, then that becomes part of the culture. That becomes part of the way we do things around here. We're just going to have a look now at how we make sure that we monitor that culture as leaders. How are we making sure that we're keeping an eye on what's happening in our cultures? Poor managers often start with a label. They might have I guess, a preconception about staff. They might label someone as having a poor attitude, not being a team player. They might sort of leap to words like saying bullying or underperforming, those sorts of things. Is that risky?
Look, it is risky because the label can push a manager towards a process or an outcome before they've actually considered the issue properly. So, a missed deadline might sort of point to someone in the manager's eyes as underperforming, but a missed deadline could simply reflect unclear priorities, workload, poor systems, or a lack of support. So there can be other things that factor into that. So, and a sharp exchange between two colleagues can be actually appropriate sometimes in the workplace because people are passionate about their work, and it can actually mean nothing. It may be a low level conduct issue, it may be conflict, or it may be a part of a repeated pattern. So a bullying allegation needs to be taken seriously, but it needs to be assessed before any conclusions reached.
So really, we're saying there that our first job as managers is to separate the issues, not rolling everything, not what we would say is approaching with a judgment or a decision that we've already made, but really sort of thinking about what might be behind some of those behaviours.
100%. So it's important to sit back and ask yourself as a manager, what was expected? What specifically happened? Is this one-off or is it a pattern? What impact is it having? Is it appropriate? We've got two experienced, passionate colleagues having a robust conversation that can be very, very appropriate, or is it something else? What has been communicated to the staff in this area? Is there a health, safety, leave or compliance issue overlapping with it? And is there anything about the work environment itself that's contributing to that problem?
Yeah, look, I think that last question there is really important, Paul. Sometimes we have to look beyond the individual or that particular situation. There might be some factors within the workplace that could be creating that pressure or conflict. We might have, some of those. We all, very aware at the moment around those 14 psychosocial hazards and risks that might contribute to injury in the workplace. It could be high workload, poor support, lack of clarity around roles, poorly managed change. So just focusing on that one employee's behaviour doesn't necessarily remove that need for us to be, again, monitoring that workplace culture, understanding what hazards exist, and we might need to actually be looking at it as a broader team or workplace design issue.
Yeah, and I think, Bronwyn, as well, the important thing is there's sometimes some things that happen when you're managing that really hit you in the face, and some red flags that mean a manager should stop, jump in and get advice before they act. So, I mean, serious things like threats or aggression, potential sexual harassment, discrimination, victimisation, where an employee might be fearful of retaliation or possible serious misconduct, significant psychosocial social risk, complaints against a senior manager, a CEO, or an executive member, or something where an external body's got an interest in it or are involved, the Fair Work
Mm-mm.
Commission or so forth.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that comes back to that safety in the workplace and making sure our employees are safe. And if there is an element that someone is unsafe, yeah, it's needing to step in and resolve that safety concern. But I guess the key is that for us as managers is to not diagnose everything in the first 5 minutes, right? We don't again, we shouldn't be rushing to judgment before we understand what's happening, but we actually need to understand enough about the situation, enough of understand what's happening with the person or the people involved to decide what happens next. So we need to sort of separate sort of things like facts, assumptions, our judgments, our preconceived notions, and we should follow a process, not start with that label that we might have given to those individuals. We're going to have a look now at a common early intervention moment. So, for those of you that have done some IHR training with us before, you know that we use our professional actors in our training. So, we have a couple of actors joining us today, and they're just going to play a scene between a manager and employee. And as you watch the scene, I just want you to notice, what does the manager see in that scene? What are they choosing to address or not address, and what manage that sends to the rest of the team? I will be playing the role of Lee in this one.
Lee, thanks for making time to see me. I actually wanted to talk to you about something that's been happening in the team meetings.
Oh, okay, sure. What's going on?
It's Chris. So whenever I suggest an idea, he pretty much shuts me down before I finish speaking. Yesterday, he laughed and said I'd understand how things really work once I'd been here a bit longer. It's happened a few times now.
Oh, Chris has always been pretty direct. I mean, that's his style, right?
And I get that people have different styles, but I mean it's making me reluctant to speak up. I don't really feel like my ideas are welcome.
Yeah, well, yeah, I wouldn't really take it personally. I mean, everybody knows what Chris is like.
Maybe. I mean, but it doesn't feel great being on the receiving end of it.
Look, just give it some time. Once you've settled in, I'm sure everything will sort itself out.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, now I'm no longer Lee. I'm just taking myself out of character for Lee, and I'll just add the spotlight for Paul to come back and join me. Jules, if you can take you can't take your spotlight off, so I will do that. Paul, were there any red flags for there in how me, the manager, Lee, handled that situation?
Yeah, Bronwyn, a few, I suppose. Certainly a few there. So the first is that Lee immediately labelled Chris's behaviour as just his style. And once we start explaining, and as a manager, probably trying to justify and normalise the behaviour, we've stopped being curious about what's really happening. So we've stopped listening to the other person's viewpoint. The second is Lee didn't ask any questions. So didn't ask whether this was a one-off or something that's happened repeatedly. Did not ask whether people had witnessed it or what impact it was having on me or the team. The other thing that stood out for me was that Lee focused on changing me as response rather than addressing Chris's behaviour. He told her not to take it. I'm sorry, Lee, that is, told her not to take it personally and to give it time, but never talked about what was going to happen as a manager. So never really offered solutions or a way forward. From an employee relations perspective, this was a missed opportunity. At this stage, we're not talking about launching an investigation or jumping into disciplinary action, but we're talking about taking the concern seriously, gathering more information, and deciding whether the behaviour needs an early conversation with Chris or interaction. And really making the employee who's raised the issue feel listened to. So that's often where organisations get into trouble. Small issues get explained away as that's just how they are, or they didn't mean anything by it. But if the behaviour continues not to get addressed, it can become a pattern, affect psychosocial safety, generate complaints, and ultimately create a much bigger problem and much bigger risks. So for me, the red flag isn't just Chris's behaviour, but it's the fact that the manager really missed an opportunity to jump in and start to do something about it early.
Mm.
So Bronwyn, what were some of your concerns?
I think for me, Paul, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. One of the key things for me is how we view and how the courts and HR view intent versus impact when we're talking about these behaviours. Chris, not in the scene there, but the individual that is dismissing that employee in those meetings, he might not actually have an intent to upset me, and it may well be his style. But if the way he engages with his colleagues creates risk or harm, whether that's physical or psychological, then it's important that the behaviour is actually called out. It's no longer okay for people to use intent as a justification for their behaviours and how those behaviours are landing or being experienced by others. So we can't dismiss impact by saying things like the person didn't mean it, it was just a joke, it's just their style. Early action protects everyone. It gives Chris, it sets that clear expectation for Chris around what behaviours are expected, and that feedback provides a clear opportunity for him to adjust his style. It supports Mia, who in coming to her manager has indicated that, that this is an issue that is impacting on her. And then it reinforces the standard for the rest of the team as well before some of those behaviours become entrenched. So again, what we're making sure that we do here is address the actual behaviour, not personalities. We need to provide early, specific and proportionate feedback, action. This is culture management. It is not overreaction. If we look at performance, we can look at the managing performance. We saw in the poll there that was one area where people might be sometimes reluctant to step in. There's a whole lot of reasons for that, but we can sort of follow the same early intervention principle. I find sometimes managers wait, they delay giving feedback, and then by the time they are ready to give the feedback, they're quite frustrated. And then they're probably coming to someone like you, Paul, or to their HR manager and asking how quickly they can move to a warning or to end employment. Our Managing Everyday Performance program addresses how to manage performance before it becomes poor. I often look at our sort of performance management systems as managing for performance, managing for good performance, not just managing poor performance. So there's things that we can do as managers to support performance and outcomes rather than just manage performance when it's not meeting those expectations.
So, Bronwyn, what are the key components of doing that?
Yeah, look, one of the key for me is that culture or that process that we have around ongoing and effective feedback. So the elements of good performance management process are starting with clear, measurable expectations. So we make sure that those goals are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. We empower and develop our staff to meet those objectives. We don't just set those objectives and let people sort of find their own way. We have our regular one-on-ones. We provide any development or support people need to be able to meet those expectations. We evaluate those performance and we do that against those clear expectations. Again, those measurable goals. We in evaluating that performance, approach with curiosity, ask those questions to understand what might be behind any situations where performance isn't meeting expectations, and then we finish out the process by making sure that we respond to that performance. That's either to reward good performance where people have met those objectives or to resolve underperformance. How does Fair Work Australia, how does the Ombudsman or the courts view giving feedback as part of the performance management cycle, Paul? We often hear managers say they're a bit reluctant to give sort of developmental or performance feedback in case they're accused of bullying. How are the courts looking at that?
It's a really good question, Bron. Well, I think number one is as managers, we often love to give positive feedback and are more reluctant to give feedback where it's constructive or in areas of improvement. I think if you're a manager who always pats your staff on the back, they'll eventually fall asleep. So you've got to be balanced in your feedback and recognise the good stuff, but also be comfortable enough and brave enough to recognise when there's issues. And managers are entitled and actually expected to manage their staff. That's what
Mm.
reasonable management action is. So you need to, as a manager, set standards, give directions and set deadlines, allocate work, give feedback, and address underperformance and misconduct. Ultimately, that's what management's all about. So the risk is not the fact that management action is taken, it's the fact it's not taken in a lot of
Mm.
cases. So where the risk is, it's the absence of management action. It's based sometimes where the management action is vague characterizations. You need to pull your socks up. I mean, but we have managers that actually tell employees that you need to pull your socks up. What does that even mean? So you've got to be consistent. You've got to be
Yeah.
clear. Employees should not be surprised by allegations or a process that's not reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah, look, for those everyday performance issues, catching them early, the manager needs to be able to describe what the gap is clearly. As you say, not just pull your socks up or those sorts of things. What is the expectation if there has been a situation where somebody has behaved in a way that's inconsistent with the values, where their performance isn't meeting expectations? What is the expectation? What occurred? What was the situation? We talk about situation, behaviour, and impact, and what improvement is required. And as you say, it shouldn't be a surprise. We should be making sure that we're having those discussions regularly in our one-on-ones. And if we're getting to the place where we are moving to a more formal response, that certainly shouldn't be a surprise for the employee. Managers also need to listen. The reason for the underperformance, as we said before, it could be a skills gap, it could be a motivational issue, but it could be some of those other what we talk about will, skill, and heal in our managing everyday performance program. It could be a heal issue. It could be unclear work priorities, workload, the system problem, system not supporting effective delivery of service. It could be a personal issue, a health issue, lack of support in the organisation. So understanding that what's contributing doesn't remove accountability for the person, but it certainly impacts on what the correct response would be in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely, Bronwyn. And I think managing performance is in a lot of ways trickier, I think, than managing conduct
Mm.
because managing performance means that the employees performed at a particular level and there's been a slip of performance. So it's identifying when the right moment is to talk and when the
Mm.
right moment is to address it, but also identifying specifically what the problem is in the performance. Managing conduct is with employees is slightly different, okay? Because usually conduct relates to an event, a situation, or a
Mm.
rolling situation that has occurred. So the question is whether a policy, standard, or lawful or reasonable direction may have been breached. The seriousness, the evidence, whether the facts are disputed, and the potential consequences will determine whether the matter can be managed through direct feedback or needs a more formal process.
Yeah, I guess really what we're saying though is in both cases, whether it's a performance or a conduct issue, managers need to avoid jumping from, the I am concerned to I have decided. Again, as I say, we approach with curiosity. Employees need a genuine opportunity to respond, and any action, as we've said before, has to be proportionate to what the issue is. So we need clear standards, regular feedback, and practical support should come before a conclusion that someone cannot or will not perform. We're just going to move to our next conversation now, and we're going to see how quickly a manager did or should move from to a formal solution before checking whether those some foundations are in place.
So I think it's about time to put Annie on a performance plan. She's missed the last two month-end deadlines, and the rest of the team are getting pretty frustrated.
Oh, okay. Well, what's happened so far? Have you spoken to her about it?
I've mentioned a couple of times that she needs to get on top of her deadlines.
Okay, but does she know which deadlines you're talking about and what you're expecting?
Well, I mean, I'd assume so. They're the month-end deadlines. She knows what's expected.
Okay. Have there been any changes recently? Any changes to things like workload, responsibilities?
Well, I mean, she's picked up payroll after Sam left, but everyone's under pressure at the moment.
Okay. Did she get much training on the payroll side when that change happened?
I mean, not really. She's been around long enough. I don't think she needs hand holding.
Okay. So have you actually asked her what's been contributing to those missed deadlines?
No, I figured we'd talk about all that once she's on the performance plan.
Hmm. So, Paul, when is early too early? Are there concerns there with the manager, Jordan, wanting to put that employee Annie straight onto a PIP?
Well, I mean, look, performance improvement plans definitely have a place, but it's not the starting point. So,
Mm.
what concerns me here is that Jordan has already decided the solution before really understanding what the problem is. So, from an employee relations perspective, the first question is always, why is this happening? So, you need to be getting all the information before you start moving down that track. So, is it a capability issue? Has the role changed? Has the workload increased? Does the employee understand what's expected? Have there been any has there been training or the right support given? Or is there something else happening outside of work that may be affecting the employee's performance? So in this case, we know Annie has taken on payroll responsibilities after someone left. It doesn't sound like they've done a great job in doing a handover or exploring whether that's had much impact. So if you jump straight to a formal performance plan, you risk treating what may have been a workload or support issue into a far bigger problem. So, and that can damage trust. It can make the employee defensive, and in some cases, it can create an unnecessary employment relation issue. It also makes it pretty hard to demonstrate procedural fairness because you usually escalate to a PIP. It shouldn't be a surprise. If the employee later asked, did anyone actually ask me what was going on before deciding I was unperforming? The answer you want us to be yes. You want them to
Mm.
know that they've
Mm.
evolved to a PIP. So moving straight to a formal performance plan should never be a surprise. It should come after you've clarified expectations, um, and provided reasonable support where appropriate and given the
Mm.
employee an opportunity to improve. So, I mean, it's a structured process. It's an escalation to avoid an ongoing performance concern. So it shouldn't be the first point of call.
And it's important too there that our response does match the cause, right? So we might need to set clearer priorities, provide some system training. There might be if someone's performance is not where we want it to be. We might need to increase our check-ins with them. We might need to look at redistribution of work, coaching, or those sorts of things. And then we also need to make sure we've got those measurable expectations and review dates in there. If Annie understands the requirements, she has the capability and support, and still doesn't improve, then a formal process might absolutely become appropriate. But it has to be the next step in a fair process, not the first real conversation. You mentioned procedural fairness there, Paul. What does that mean in the context of managing performance?
Yeah, look, it's a term that I'm sure most people watching along today would be familiar with. But procedural fairness, natural justice, reasonable person test, they're all terms we hear a lot. But at their core, they're really about giving people a fair opportunity through a process where they're allowed to respond. So it's really meaning that the employees understand what the concerns are, what's expected of them, and they're given a genuine opportunity to respond before decisions are made about their employment or a disciplinary process. And in many cases, they're given a chance to either turn the behaviour or turn the performance issue around. So in practice, it means avoiding assumptions, and before conclusions are reached, we need to understand the facts. So, have expectations been clearly communicated? Has the employee been told specifically about what they're falling short on or of the required standard? Have they had a chance to explain what's happening from their perspective? Have we considered whether there are factors contributing to the issue beyond what we can see? So, workload, training, resources, personal circumstances. Procedural fairness also means approaching any process with an open mind. So if you've already decided the outcome before you've entered into those conversations, it's going to be pretty tough to argue that the process was genuinely fair. So importantly, procedural fairness does not mean avoiding difficult decisions or guarantee an outcome. But employees can still be performance managed, and sometimes employment may come to an end. So procedural fairness is about ensuring that safe process, that fair, safe, balanced process that reached that conclusion. So from an employee relations perspective, organisations that are consistently applying procedural fairness not only make better decisions, they also significantly reduce the risk of grievances, unfair dismissal claims, and disputes. And they put themselves in a very strongly a defendable position, a strong position if it's ever argued afterwards.
Mm. Yeah, certainly just putting someone on a performance plan or getting HR to assist you with that is not a substitute for leadership. We need to make sure, as we saw through that entire employment performance management life cycle, that we're setting those expectations, providing regular feedback, understanding the reasons behind any poor performance, and then supporting that improvement before we escalate through that stage. Paul, not every issue should or can be resolved through that sort of a process. When a person maybe raises a complaint about someone else, maybe there's a sensitive concern, does the leader's role change?
No, look, the important part is, Bronwyn, that managers need to treat every matter that's raised seriously, stay objective, listen, and gather enough information to understand the allegation or the risk. So I'll refer to it as a triage stage. So we need to get the information. This isn't an investigation or trying to solve the problem. We need to get the information to make sure we know or can assess what the right way forward is. I was going to say the manager shouldn't be cross-examining the person. They shouldn't be confronting the other party or trying to decide anything at this stage. They just need to get the information. And sometimes it's not them who does the triage. They gather the information, and if it's too much for them, they might need to go to someone in HR or a more senior manager to help do that.
Yeah. We need to, if someone does come to us with an issue, they might have an issue around someone else's behaviour in the workplace that we would say is against that organisational policy, is unlawful. Then we do need to take that seriously. We also need to make sure that we understand confidentiality properly. That sort of sensitive information does need to be handled carefully and shared on a needs to know basis. And as you said there, as a manager, you might need to go along to your HR or people and culture team just to get some support around what the organisational policy is, what the process is in that space. I think it's also important that we make sure that we're not promising secrecy or what I would say is anonymity, because the organisation might need to act to manage risk and provide a fair process.
Yeah, absolutely, Bronwyn. So the manager should check if there's any immediate safety or wellbeing risk, whether the conduct is continuing, listen and explore concerns about retaliation or other issues, provide appropriate support, and explain when the person is going to receive an update. So you may not have all the answers, but you can say, look, I'm going to go away and find out more information. I'll come back to you this afternoon or tomorrow morning. And if you say you're going to do that, act on it. Even when the person does not want to make a formal complaint, the organisation still may need to act if the conduct is serious or there's an ongoing risk. So I was going to say, one of the key things I often say, Bronwyn, as a HR manager and professional, is my office isn't a confessional. If people come in and disclose certain information to me that requires an action or response, I have a duty to act. And so if they request confidentiality, you can't guarantee it or promise it, because you may very well have a duty to act.
Yeah, so that duty sits under a couple of pieces of our legislation. Paul, certainly under the Sex Discrimination Act, we have that positive duty to prevent as well as respond to sexual discrimination and sexual harassment from happening. We have that duty of care under our work health and safety, occupational health and safety regulations to create safe workplaces. In other words, we don't just respond to injuries after they happen. That means we might have to act even when an employee doesn't make a formal complaint. As soon as we become aware of those unsafe behaviours, as managers, we are responsible for that. We have that obligation to respond. But as you mentioned before, Paul, response doesn't necessarily mean jumping to a formal process, putting someone, through a disciplinary process. Our aim is always to create those safe workplaces. Again, we talk about intent versus impact. Somebody might not be aware that their behaviour is having that negative impact on somebody else. So our response pathway needs to match the issue. Lower level behaviours might be able to be addressed through a direct conversation with that person, some coaching, certainly monitoring what's happening in the team, doing some training in the team around those behaviours. A relationship conflict might be suitable for something like a facilitated discussion or a mediation, where that sort of participation between the parties is both safe and voluntary.
Yeah, that's right. And then the serious stuff, Bronwyn, serious and disputed allegations may require a complaint assessment or even an investigation.
Mm.
So, and then where workload, support, change, or team dynamics are contributing, there may be a psychosocial risk assessment that needs to happen, or even a team intervention. So there's a number of ways that organisations can approach matters. And it may not just be an individual matter; it may be a collective matter.
Yeah, and certainly, and we're not saying that the person that's experiencing the behaviour, the complainant, that we will be refer them to in our sort of formal sense. It's not saying that their preferred approach doesn't matter. It absolutely does, and we should make sure that we're taking them on that journey of response. We should be making sure that they understand that they will be supported, that there are supports available for them, that they will be safe from victimisation. But it's not the only consideration. Again, because we have that duty of care, if there's a serious issue, if there's safety issues, if there's power imbalances, we all need to make sure that those things shape our response to that. We're just going to have a look now at our final scene. And in this scene, I want you to listen for what you feel the manager needs to do immediately and what they should avoid promising.
Have you got a minute? There's just something I'm not really sure what to do about.
Oh, okay. What's happened?
So it's Chris. Over the last few weeks, he's been sending me text messages asking after work, asking me out, even though I've pretty much told him I'm not interested. And I guess making comments that make me feel uncomfortable. And then yesterday he said that I should be careful because he's got a lot of influence around here.
Oh, okay.
Look,
Right.
I don't want to make a big deal out of it. I definitely don't want to put in a formal complaint. I, I mean, I need it to stop.
Well, I guess well, the obvious thing would be for me to have a quiet word with Chris and ask him to stop.
No, I'm sorry. I really don't want him to know that I've said anything. I'm worried it's just going to make everything worse.
Okay, well, if that's what you want, I'll just keep this between us. I won't raise it with Chris or with HR.
Yeah, thank you.
But if you don't want me to speak to Chris, I'm really not sure what else I can do.
Well, I guess I just thought you might be able to tell me what my options are.
Okay. Okay. Paul, what are some of the concerns there? Like, surely if the employee doesn't want us to raise the issue with the person, there's not much more that we can do, right?
Well, look, Bronwyn, I think maybe Lee's intentions may be good. In some ways, Lee's trying to respect Morgan's wishes and avoid making the situation worse. But there are a few things there that concern me. The first is Lee immediately jumped into a solution before really understanding the issue. So Lee's response was to go into fix it mode, and
Hmm.
I'll go and have a word with Chris rather than asking a few more questions about what happened and whether Morgan felt safe and what the outcome was that she was hoping for. And then when Morgan disclosed that she didn't want Chris spoken to, Lee assumed there was nothing else that she could do. So in reality, there are often a number of things available. And part of the manager's role is to help the employee understand what those options are. And that could have even been if Lee had to circle back to HR or somewhere to find out what those options actually were. So the other missing thing was uh, the other concerning thing rather was the discussion about confidentiality.
Hmm.
Okay, employees often say they don't want to make a formal complaint, and that's something we should listen to and respect. But managers also need to be careful to imply that information can simply be kept between the two of them, because, as I said earlier, officers aren't confessionals, and we have duty of care in a lot of cases that where we can't provide that guarantee. So, depending on what's being disclosed, the organisation may have obligations to take action further to protect the employee or others. So for me, the issue isn't that Lee didn't have all the answers. The issue was that Lee didn't slow the conversation down, gather enough information, and explain what the next steps or possible options might be. And that may not have been on the day. Lee, in that moment, Lee could have gone away and got more information. So um, that's often the difference between a manager who feels they have to solve the problem immediately and one who understands their role is to support the employee in a process. So assess the situation and make sure the right process is being followed.
Yeah, we often do want to sort of step in and resolve, don't we? It's our first reaction as managers, as humans. I guess a safer first response might have been something along the lines of, "Thank you for telling me this. I will treat this carefully, but I can't promise it will only stay with us because the organisation might need to respond. But I will only share it with people who need to know." Before we talk about options, are you safe at work today? And is there anything that you need from me immediately?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I think Lee should clarify enough information to assess the risk, seek advice, explain the available options, agree on the next update, and take some reasonable steps to prevent any victimisation or further harm. So, and look, if it's beyond Lee's skill set, then Lee perhaps should have gone and got further advice and support from a more senior manager or HR who would have that information.
Yeah. Yeah. So we need to listen. We need to take it seriously. We might, again, intent versus impact, we might not think that the behavior was particularly serious because it's not behavior that would upset us. But if somebody is coming to us and sharing that behavior's had an impact on them, we have to take it seriously. We need to be clear about what those confidentiality limits are. I always say to people, there's a difference between confidentiality and anonymity. We always keep these things confidential, but anonymity is a different issue, and we do have to be careful with that because of people having procedural fairness. We need to assess immediate risk. Certainly, if there's any risk, physical or psychosocial risk to an employee, we need to respond to that immediately, and then we need to be clear about what our next steps are. So, as we've seen today, there isn't necessarily one response that's going to fit every workplace issue. The right response is going to depend on the nature of the behaviour, the impact it's having on the person and other people in the team, what you know, and what you're trying to achieve. I think one of the biggest leaders' mistakes is assuming we've almost got the two extremes. Either people jump to everything's a formal response, or everything should just, be ignored and resolve itself. In reality, obviously, there's a whole range of responses in between.
Yeah, exactly, Bronwyn. And I think before deciding what to do, I'd encourage managers to pause. Yeah, and remember that you don't have to solve it on the spot. And you're more likely to make a poor judgment call if you do try and solve it on the spot. You know, that red brain, heat
Mm,
of the moment decision or action. When often as well, the employee, when they're raising a complaint in that first stage, often just want to be heard. So you
mm.
do have that time to draw a breath. So managers should get fully informed about a fully informed perspective about what they're dealing with, and perhaps simply ask themselves a few questions. Do I have enough detail on what's exactly happened? Do I have enough facts or am I making assumptions? Is this a performance issue, a conduct issue, a capacity or operational issue, or is it something else? So elementize what you're dealing with. Is there an immediate safety or legal risk here? And am I the right person to deal with this? Or do I need support from HR, employee relations, or a more senior manager? So taking a few moments to work through those questions often leads to a much better response than reacting or overreacting in the moment.
Yeah, and obviously remembering an appropriate response doesn't always mean that formal response. Sometimes it's coaching, sometimes it's setting those clear expectations around behaviors, around performance. Sometimes we do need to gather some more information, and sometimes, as you say, we need to step in, we need to go straight to a formal process, and we might need to involve HR or an external agency or organisation to help us do that. The important thing is that the response is fair, proportionate, and based on the issues, not on our assumptions or our emotions in the moment.
Yeah, look, I'm spot on. And from my perspective, and would say that the perspective of the courts and commissions we deal with,
Mm.
that's what good employee relations is about. Not making every issue bigger than it needs to be, but also not overlooking behaviour that could become a bigger problem if it's left unchecked. So finding that right balance in triaging a matter, making informed decisions, and taking the right making the right judgment call in the response. So Early, fair, and well-considered action almost always produces better outcomes. And avoiding the issue is not the solution, and jumping into a formal process or jumping in from the deep end is not the best formal action.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings us to the formal part of today's session. I have seen the chat box going off there in the corner of my eye, so I understand there's a lot of questions that have come through. We're not going to have time to deal with that today, but we will review those questions and get back to people, either Paul or myself, with a response to that question. We've covered why culture matters, how leaders influence every day, some of the common mistakes we see when responding to those workplace issues, and a practical way to think about choosing an appropriate response.
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. I think, look, for people out there, IHR Australia does help organisations manage challenging workplace behaviour through a combination of services, investigations, facilitations, mediations. We help triage matters as they come up. We provide HR consulting support, and the wonderful Bronwyn and her team provide some very good specialised training programs. So if you feel that IHR can support you, by all means reach out to us when our contact details are there on that slide on the screen there. So thank you so much for participating with us today and being part of this webinar.
Thank you, everyone.